Hello, everyone. Good morning. Good morning. My name is Adam Nicolai. I'm the Director of Education and Public Programs at Oceanside Museum of Art. And we're so happy to gather together this morning for Coffee with the Collector with Hugh Davies. Hugh Davies is the Director Emeritus at the Museum of Contemporary Art, San Diego. We couldn't be more thrilled to have him here today for a conversation with our Executive Director, Maria Mingalone, who we'll see in just a moment. But today's program is really the perfect companion piece to something that's happening all throughout the month of June at OMA, our virtual art auction. So if you haven't had a chance yet, you at home, you can bid on more than 80 artworks that are featured in our art auction. If you hang on just after today's broadcast, I'll be sharing just a little information about how to do so at the end. So please hold on. But in addition to our silent auction, which is online, we're also having so many live events that you can participate in. So there's live stream events that are happening from the museum, also public programs that are happening virtually, all surrounding our art auction and celebrating really art itself and collecting art over your lifetime. Stay on and I'll share more information about that. But if you are new to Zoom, at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a few interactive features. One is a chat box at the bottom of the screen. So if you have anything to share or have any ideas you'd like to share during the broadcast, and you want to share with everyone at home, please put that in the chat box for all to see. Also, after the conversation, you'll have the chance to participate in the digital Q&A. So if you have any questions that come up during this amazing conversation, which we'll see in just a moment, please put that in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to get to that at the end. So I hope everyone has their coffee mugs ready. And Maria, do you have your coffee mug? That's perfect. So everyone has their coffee mugs ready. I'm going to pass it over to Maria Mingalone, who you see on your screen. And she's the director of the museum. So she's our fearless leader who's been at the helm for, I believe, 5 years now at the museum, but comes with a wealth of experience, over 30 years in the museum field. So we're so excited that she's agreed to be the host moderator for today's discussion, all the way from her home. Oh, and I see Hugh has popped on the screen as well. So I'm going to pass it over to the two of you. It's what the people came for, but please take it away.
Thanks so much, Adam. Thank you. It'll be actually 4 years. So I moved to San Diego to take the helm at Oceanside Museum of Art in August of 2016. And having arrived here, I really learned about an incredibly rich community of art makers and creatives that I wasn't aware of from my history in New York and in Western Massachusetts. We're really excited to have you here, Hugh, and to talk a little bit about collecting, and it's a great conversation to have as people may be considering purchasing art in OMA's art auction, which is closing on June 28th. But why we wanted and what we thought was really interesting about you as a collector is that you come with a wealth of experience both professionally and personally as a collector, and I thought that combination was really interesting and unique. And many of you know, many people know you. You've had a long distinguished career as the director at the Museum of Contemporary Art San Diego, and where you were instrumental in 30+ years of collecting for that institution and policy making for collecting for MCASD. But what people may not know is other professional experiences you've had and how they might have influenced your collecting as well. So would you tell us a little bit about that?
I'd be glad to. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to have this conversation with Maria, which I'm delighted to participate in. And I congratulate you on 4 splendid years. It's been a wonderful addition to the entire ecology, the cultural ecology of San Diego and San Diego County, to have somebody of your caliber take over the Oceanside Art Museum.
Thank
and
you.
I want to let you know your cat just walked by behind you, but you probably were aware of that. And now I've forgotten the question, sorry.
That's okay. So we were
previous
talking
experience.
about other professional experiences you've had and how that may have influenced your collecting.
I did my PhD in art history, and I did my PhD on the British painter Francis Bacon.
Mm-hmm.
And that got me into a lot of galleries and a lot of museums, particularly in England, obviously. But in terms of collecting, his work, when I began to interview him, was extremely expensive, and only became more so as he became more famous.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember recommending to my uncle, who lived in England, that he should buy a Francis Bacon, and he just laughed. He thought they were the ugliest, most horrific works. He wouldn't want to live with one. But had he followed my advice, his children and grandchildren would be very well off now. But while I was first in the art world, when people would ask me if I was collecting anything, I would tell them that until I could afford a really good color TV, I wasn't going to buy any art, because I could learn much more from having a TV. And it just was you know, as a poor graduate student, you have to make these priorities. The only other job I've had other than running the Museum of Contemporary Art in San Diego was I was the founding director of what is now the University Museum of Contemporary Art at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst in Western Massachusetts. And when I came to direct their new museum, they had been collecting for several years, but they'd focused their collection on works on paper because the prices were more affordable, storage issues were more manageable. So they collected prints and drawings. And then when I arrived there in 1974, I added photographs to the work on paper collection. So that very much shaped my vision of collecting, because works on paper tend to be smaller in scale, more intimate, and often the artist's hand is very evident. So you really have a sense of both their thinking and their sort of facility with the medium, be it watercolor or pencil drawing or printmaking. But at the same time, the new Fine Arts Center that the museum was located in leaked. It was built in Western Massachusetts of cast concrete, and those rough winters, putting salt on the plazas, led to the ceiling of the museum leaking. So as a result of not being able to show paintings in the major space, I initiated a program of inviting artists in New York, only 3 hours away, who were makers of sculpture, to create projects at the museum. We had students who were work study students who had great talent in carpentry and painting and things like that. And so they would help these artists such as Vito Conchi and Dennis Oppenheim and Alice Aycock and George Trackus build new pieces. And then we would, at the closure of the exhibition, we would either take it apart and reuse the elements, or if the artist wished, we would rent a U-Haul truck and ship whatever elements they wanted back to New York City. So that really got me into site-specific and installation art, which is something that wasn't widely collected in the 70s. And I brought that instinct to the Museum of Contemporary Art in San Diego. And we would, on an annual basis, back in the 80s and 90s, invite artists from other countries, often from Great Britain, to come and do a residency. So for instance, Nish Kapoor came and stayed for a month and made an exhibition with us in the early 90s. And then we acquired a piece from that exhibition. And the real model of collecting that I favored was to buy works out of our own exhibitions. Because when you do an exhibition with an artist, as you know very well, Maria, you spend 3 to 5 years working with them. You really know their work perhaps better than anyone. So you can carefully determine which pieces are important and which piece would be good for a museum to own. And then as you buy a piece out of each exhibition, you create a record of the museum's exhibiting activity. And this becomes the sort of important residue, the history of that exhibition record.
There was, we were talking earlier as we were planning, and Hugh, you mentioned William Kettridge. Did you want to, was that one of an early piece that was influenced back in the early part of your career?
That was,
Do we want to bring that image up? Great.
Oh, great, there it is. William Kettridge, as you know very well, is a South African artist who is now, has a worldwide reputation. But I was born in South Africa, so I've always kept my eye on things artistic coming out of that country. And I noticed a video of Kettridge's that I saw at a gallery in Los Angeles, and based on that video, contacted him and invited him to make an exhibition and a residency with us in San Diego. And he accepted, and we were going to have him come with his wife and children, but their academic year is the opposite of ours, so the timing didn't work out, and he came alone. But he showed, he premiered one of his films, Weighing and Wanting, and he showed all the drawings that were studies for that film. I later learned it was his first museum exhibition, so very proud that Museum of Contemporary Art San Diego was the first to show Kettridge. And this is an example of the kind of collecting that a museum director can do that is not in conflict with his or her institution. And these are tiny prints. They're probably 3 inches square. They're actually self-portraits of William New doing some activity in the studio. And he gave these to me just as a present, a memento of our working together, and as an expression of thanks for doing the exhibition and the accompanying catalog. As a museum director, you have to be very careful that in your own collecting activity, you in no way compete with the museum, because it would be unseemly and unethical to be buying work and that should first be offered to the museum for their collection. So in our museum, we had the policy that, and most museums do, that any of the staff who buy art have to offer the art to the museum, to the museum's collection committee made up of trustees and other volunteers. And then if they decide to buy it, they pay you what you pay for it and they own it. And so every year, those of us on the staff would submit a list of anything we had acquired for the museum to make its choice. This is an interesting piece by the great glass artists, Einar and Jamex de la Torre. And several years ago, probably 20 years ago now, we had shown their work on numerous occasions in the museum. We commissioned new pieces by them, and we owned several major pieces by the de la Torres. And I was doing a studio visit and saw this wonderful heart they'd made. And I thought, boy, I'd love to have that in the heart of my home. But I knew it would be an awkward discussion for them with a museum director who had the power to show their work or buy their work for the museum or recommend them to other curators and artists. So I said to them that I'd shown a photograph of the heart to one of my trustees. The trustee wanted to purchase it, and I had been asked to facilitate that purchase. And I explained to them that this collector trustee was well-heeled and could afford to pay their correct price. And they gave me the price, and then I wrote them a check so that I could own the piece. And then, of course, I offered it to the museum because they owned several major, extensive installation pieces. They turned down the option to acquire this piece. So I've owned it ever since, and it's been at the heart of whatever house I have lived in, and I've had such joy from living with their work.
That's terrific. The de la Torres have a piece in our art auction, and they were recently in a show that the museum did called San Diego Surreal, and they are doing a major commission for the hotel project that the museum is working on. So we're really lucky to have them in our community for sure. And did you have a story about the Marcos Ramirez Ere piece?
Yes, and I should mention that you also had a fantastic exhibition of Marcos Ramirez's wall quite recently at the museum. Marcos, another great artist of our region, like the de la Torres, In the year 2000, I was a curator, one of 5 curators of the Whitney Biennial. And with the blessings of my co-curators, we invited Marcos to make a new piece for the Whitney. And he chose to, I'm showing you an image, a reproduction of what he made, which is the Mexican flag. You just see the center panel here without the red and the green. But if you notice the snake in the official Mexican flag, the snake is being bitten by the eagle, who is basically killing the snake. But in Marcos's retelling of that parable, you now see in this image, the snake is biting the neck of the eagle as the eagle bites the tail of the snake. And this is Marcos's way of saying that the people could rise up against the authority of the eagle and balance this equation of power in the country. So he painted a large version of this flag in 3 panels. It was mounted on the wall out just behind the big window on Madison Avenue. And we were very nervous because had the Mexican consul in New York seen this, he could have prosecuted Marcos Ramirez Ere for changing the Mexican flag, which is at the time was illegal. And so Marcos, as a gesture of gratitude for being included in this important exhibition, gave me a light box with a reproduction of the piece seen in the window. And I've just, it's hard to read in the light box, so I just borrowed this graphic to illustrate the tale. And again, this light box was off to the museum, and because the museum has commissioned and owns many pieces by Marcos, they were not interested in the light box. So I've kept that ever since.
Fantastic. That's nice. And have you acquired anything recently that you'd like to share?
Well, our most, I say our, my wife, Alison, and I have been collecting together for the past decade. We acquired a piece by a very good sculptor, Chris Puzio, just within the last month. And Chris is an artist I've had my eye on for ages. He's done a lot of public projects around San Diego. And this particular piece, I don't know if you have an image of it.
I think we do. Yeah, we could pull up a piece of that Chris Puzio sculpture, sure.
But
it's a little further down, yeah. Number 14.
This is the noble Adam scrambling with the slides. There we are, perfect. So this is at our house, and it's a piece made of welded bronze, and each one of those elements is quite similar, but the way Chris, and that is Chris wearing his COVID-19 mask, who's just installed it on a wall in our garden. And I would point out a through line in these slides. You can see in the right our poodle looking through the window at what's going on outside. But just love this piece by Chris Puzio because when the sun hits it, the shadows are just extraordinary. And then at night, there's a light above it that gives the same effect, but not as richly as the sun passing by the piece. And so with this simple element, it's sort of a diamond shape with an aperture in the center, by multiplying it and welding them together, he creates these really beautiful organic / geometric pieces. And so that's our most recent acquisition.
That's terrific. It's a beautiful piece. I think people probably are really excited to learn more about look at some other examples and samples of artwork in your collection. And how about if we jump up to that Alison Saar's piece, and we'll go through a few other pieces in your collection, if you will?
Great.
That'd be great. So we'll wait for Adam to get that piece up. Thanks so much, Adam.
I should just say that my wife and I have chosen to focus on works on paper as the core of our collection, restricting ourselves, much like the University of Massachusetts, to drawings, prints, and photographs. But obviously with works like Chris Puzio's sculpture, we break those rules fairly often. And with regional artists in San Diego, Tijuana, we buy work that we love and work that we want to live with, and we don't restrict ourselves. But this is an example of an artist who is based in Los Angeles, shows with the LA Louvre Gallery, Alison Saar. The title of the piece is White Guise, and guise is G-U-I-S-E. And here you see one of her characteristic women wearing a sheer garment. It's a print that's printed on a wallpaper-like background where you see cotton represented. And then cotton is bursting out of her head, almost like her head is exploding. And in her hand, she carries an iron, an old-fashioned iron. But on the tip of the iron, which you cannot see in this image, there are drops of blood. And it's almost as if this woman who has been politely doing domestic chores for too long has finally become violent. So it's a very powerful and moving print, and very appropriate to what we're experiencing now with these marvelous protests against police brutality with the Black Lives Matter movement.
That's right. Yeah. And I think we have a few, thank you so much for sharing that. And yes, it is very timely. And I think we had a Tom Friedman.
Yes, this is a work that we acquired, perhaps 8 years ago. And it's a fairly large drawing. It's probably 3-4 feet squarish. And it is the most complex image you can imagine. You can see how it goes into depth. And it's like some chemistry formula or some depiction of the nervous system of a large creature and these different colors. I mean, it's like a subway diagram in England that's gone crazy. But it's an obsessive drawing that Tom Friedman obviously spent days getting deeper and deeper into this drawing. So it's a joy to live with, and every time I look, I find new things in it. It's just a limitless source of intrigue for me and for Faye.
It's a gorgeous piece, really beautiful.
And that piece, he's an American artist based in New York, but we actually purchased it from a gallery in London when we were visiting London. This work by Robert Gober is just a very small drawing, almost a life-size drawing of the toe of a lace-up moccasin or shoe, slip-on shoe. And it was, in fact, a study for a large print he was making. And this shoe appears in the upper left-hand corner of this large print. But we saw it at a gallery in Los Angeles and were just intrigued by the way it was presented. And it captures a lot of Gober, if you know his works of a man's leg coming out from a wall, the actual hair embedded in the wax of the sculpture of the leg. This shoe seemed to be related to those disembodied parts that Gober has worked with. A lot of his work relating to AIDS and loss of life from AIDS that continues to be there is yet to be a vaccine for HIV.
Very nice, thank you. And then Ken Price is
here. Ken Price recently passed away, but great ceramic artist based in Los Angeles, and also made wonderful small watercolors and drawings. And we just love the sky in this piece. It's sort of foreboding sky over that cozy little residence on the top of the hill. It's almost as if the skies are about to open, and to use the watercolor medium to sort of express that water might come soon from the sky, I thought was a lovely sort of artistic conceit that he's employed.
very nice. Thanks so much for sharing those. I wanted to talk a little bit about being here in the Southern California region, San Diego region, and while I don't want to make the assumption that it's influenced your collecting, I'm curious if it has influenced your collecting, and if so, how?
Well, very much so. When I was director of the Museum of Contemporary Art, we collected internationally, but we focused very much on artists of our region including Los Angeles and Tijuana. And we also focused a great deal on art from Latin America. We were one of the, I think, first museums in the United States to have that as a focus back in the early 80s. In terms of our personal collection, we again, although we travel extensively, we collect primarily regionally. We primarily collect work by San Diego, Tijuana artists, because if you don't support your own artists, who will support them? And we're blessed in this city in having universities with very strong art departments at all four universities, UCSD, San Diego State, University of San Diego, and Point Loma Nazarene all have strong art departments. And as a result, the faculty are here and their students in many cases remain in San Diego as long as they can afford to, and that it isn't inhibiting careers. So, and it's just a matter of where we can see work most easily. We do the vast majority of our purchasing of art, if not in San Diego, Tijuana, in Los Angeles, just because we frequently visit to see museum exhibitions and gallery exhibitions. And it's easy to do artist studio visits, which is a great joy, getting to know artists that way and seeing a lot of their work firsthand before potentially making an acquisition, a purchase.
It is. That's a great benefit, right? To really get to know the artists, be able to do studio visits, watch their careers on an intimate local level. It's really terrific. We have a few examples of additional regional artists that you collect. So we'll bring those up on the slides. In addition to, you spoke about Chris Puzio and Marcos and the De La Torres. But here is the Manny Farber. So let's share a little bit with the audience these other local artists that you have in your collection.
Yes, Manny Farber passed away a few years ago, but he was a leading film critic, and also his film criticism supported his painting until he became a faculty member at UCSD, where he served on the faculty for many years. And many of the great artists that program has produced studied with Manny Farber. This is a drawing of Manny's, probably 2 foot square, called Three Buglers. And they're tobacco pouches, bugler tobacco pouches. And then Manny often made still lifes on tabletops, just arranging personal items in a way that he found satisfying. And I love the way these three buglers are lined up almost in military fashion. And then there's a tin on the right, which I think it's like Prince Albert or one of those characters, again, at tobacco. And then these labels on the right are sort of regimented. And then the cigar provides a diagonal. And in the center, just this gray center with nothing occurring is very typical of Manny Farber's ability to move your eye around a painting or a drawing when it never comes to rest anywhere. It's constantly moving, and to avoid having, all the action be in the center. Very, very, very subtle and accomplished drawing by a man who'd been painting for well over 50 years by the time he made this drawing, and acquired from the Quint Gallery, which is one of the great, probably the best gallery in San Diego of the last 40 years. Quint Gallery supported a lot of the best artists in San Diego, so we're indebted to them for keeping us apprised not only of San Diego artists, but also of international artists they've brought in.
That brings me up to, Hugh, that leads me into a question I wanted to ask you. I was introduced through Mark Quint to Manny Farber's work, and then he recently there was a beautiful exhibition up at the Museum of Contemporary Art in LA of Manny's paintings.
Yes.
And for the artists who are in San Diego, do you have any tips and tricks for our regional artists that you might share?
Well, I would say about our region that there's a phrase, you're never a prophet in your own land. And that is very much true of artists resident in San Diego. We have artists of tremendous caliber in this community. Only looking at the roster of artists in your auction shows what great variety and strength we have in our region. But people, art collectors tend to want to go to Los Angeles to buy work, which is fine. For many years, they would go to New York to buy work. Mm-hmm. One of our great local art dealers is Jose Tesende, and he was one of the few U.S. dealers who had access to Henry Moore's sculpture, and he would always have a piece at his gallery here in La Jolla. And he told me a story of he once had to fly to New York to meet with a collector from Rancho Santa Fe because they essentially only took it seriously if they were meeting in New York to look at.
Wow, that's quite a story.
Yeah, I mean, this was a very parochial collecting coast back 25, 30 years ago, and only recently has Los Angeles and our region been recognized and asserted itself as a major art capital. I think on a par with New York and on a par with London and Paris and Berlin. But Ruben is an artist whose family lives in Oceanside, as you well know, Maria.
That's right.
They run an incredible chicken restaurant. I first became aware of Ruben's work when he had a show in Los Angeles at a gallery, and then we invited him to make an installation at our at the museum's downtown space in the Santa Fe Depot, and he did a huge scale, wonderful installation of pallets and reinforcing rod, re-rod, long sections of re-rod, sort of making like spider-like forms. It was enormous. And my colleague at the time, Dennis Zakis, who ran the Orange County Museum of Art, called me up and said, why don't we acquire this piece between our two institutions? So we were lucky enough to be able to acquire this major piece and share the expense, not only of purchasing it, but the responsibility of storing all these elements, which takes up, you know, many hundred square feet to store them. This drawing is one that Faye and I acquired from Ruben, from his gallery, the Vielmeter Gallery in Los Angeles, 2 years ago when we were living in LA. And it's a depiction of a sculpture he made, which is if you took a street sign and uprooted it, you'd find this concrete base to it. But he's connected 5 concrete bases to this one post. And it's, again, on sort of, it's very roughly made and built up textures and surfaces, and very much the drawing of a sculptor with its materiality and sort of strong sculptural form depicted.
It's a beautiful drawing. And then Lillian.
Lillian Martinez, when we were chatting earlier, Maria, you had asked that Faye and I, when we collect, what happens if we disagree?
That's right.
And it's surprising how often we agree, but every now and then one of us will have a passion. And this was a passion that Faye had when we were visiting the one of the art fairs in Los Angeles. We both actually loved this piece because of this strange, surreal image of a woman lying on a beach with a tiny head and sort of these huge arms. And then there's a poodle, and we have 2 poodles. So right away, Faye's heartstrings were struck by this poodle with his tongue out. And you can see there's a comb next to him. And then this sort of beach towel that you would expect the figure to be lying on. But a very small, modest drawing, an artist who was not well known at the time. This was probably 4 years ago. And this drawing was, well, I don't know, $300 or $400. And we love it. We've sort of lived with it ever since. And it's a very comforting image to go back to. But that was a piece that as soon as Faye spotted it at the art fair, she summoned me over and said, this is something I think we should consider. And I concurred immediately. You know, and if collectors always look back and at the ones that got away. In our case, there are not that many that I can think of that got away because, as I say, we generally agree on things, and happy to defer to each other's collecting passion, as the case may be.
I think the next image, was this your passion?
Yes, this is one of my, Sandy Rodriguez, another LA-based artist. I've known Sandy for a long time as a colleague and friend. She worked in education and museums, and in addition to being an artist, supporting her artwork. And now she's enjoying great success, I'm very pleased to say, with her artworks. This again is a relatively small drawing on handmade paper of an apuntia. Napolita is nopal, is the Spanish word for cactus. And you can see this beautiful blossoming cactus she's created in watercolors, and she grinds a lot of her own pigments to make these colors. And then if you see on the right of the cactus, there is a helicopter. And this is a reference to the border. And it's hard to see in this image, but the body of the helicopter is actually a skull, as if these helicopters are harbingers of death, which for undocumented peoples trying to make it through the desert to get to a job or family in the United States, this is what they dread, is seeing one of these death ships in the air. So it's a very beautiful kind of naturalistic rendering of an indigenous plant, but it also has this reference to what happens in the desert. And that was a piece that we acquired from the Charlie Janes Gallery. Charlie had a preparator who had become ill. I think he had cancer and he had no medical program. So Charlie hosted an exhibition, a group exhibition of LA artists who contributed works to raise money to help pay for his preparator's illness. And just as your auction that's on now is a great way for collectors to find first-rate works at very reasonable prices, this was a way for us not only to acquire Sandy's work, whom we admire, but also to support a good cause, a worthy cause.
Absolutely. And we would have had our auction in March, and for obvious reasons, we had to cancel that singular event. But what we found has been, the silver lining is that we've been hosting events like this, and also conversations with artists and studio tours with artists all through the entire month of June, all of whom are part of our art auction. And I think it's been a much stronger way for people to really learn and get behind the scenes and learn more about the artists whose work is on view, rather than just, a little bio about them that's in our catalog or on the website. So it's been terrific. And then who knew that right now, buying local artists' work is so important, right, to sustain the creative people of our community, and also to help support the museum as well. So it's very timely. Yep, and we're really grateful for the opportunity to do that. So shameless plug on my part.
I join you. I'm not an entirely unbiased person because I admire you and I admire your museum so much. But the opportunities to add to one's collection at very reasonable prices is exemplified by your auction. I'm sad to say I've been overbid a couple of times already, but I'm not giving up.
Persevere. And don't forget to be there on June 28th, because that's when it
Yes.
goes out and people will jump in right before you. So I wanted to get back to our conversation. I know that you did mention that you've been collecting seriously together with your wife Faye, and you did share a little bit about negotiating. How do you negotiate when you have differences or different interests? And we looked and learned a lot about a lot of the works on paper that you have. And I understand that you do have site-specific and also, you know, sculptural works in your collection. So want to talk a little bit about that, and we'll bring up the some of those images. And does Faye want to jump in and say hi and sit in?
Yeah, please.
We have the Tara Donovan. Hi, Faye. Nice to see you.
Hello.
This great Tara Donovan was a work that Faye acquired before we got married. And she, you might explain how you came by it.
It was at Miami Basel. And she is an artist who's actually represented by Quint Gallery here in town, also by Pace Gallery in New York. But I got the piece on a secondary market from a London gallery that was present at Art Basel, and just was fascinated by it. It's actually made up of thousands of buttons glued together. And you look at it, it looks like upside down stalagmites or stalactites or whatever they're called. But just the fact that they're buttons.
I can try and show it to you here. Oh, I guess I can't. Can you see it?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it lives very happily in the corner of the living room.
That's nice to see the scale. It looks larger than when you're looking at it here on the slide.
Yeah, it's about 3.5 feet.
Yep.
Going towards 4 feet. And as Faye says, it's the triumph of the glue gun. This piece would be inconceivable without glue guns.
Well, and the other thing that's interesting about the piece is just when each time we've moved is the process that's required to move it. It's got its own case, it's got its own palette and on rollers, and it takes like 5 or 6 guys to move it every time.
How much does it weigh, Faye? Or do you know?
I think it's 400 pounds.
Yeah, and it's the weight, and it's also the fragility of it, because they're all glued together.
Sure. And I was invited to your house for the unveiling of a special piece. Maybe we could pull up that image.
There it is. This is a 7-foot shell cast of resin that is backlit with LED lights. And it was made by Belis Iristai, who has, again, a marvelous piece in your auction that, actually, I shouldn't talk it up because then somebody will outbid me again. It's actually a terrible piece in your auction. I wouldn't advise anybody to consider acquiring it. I'm joking completely. But the house that we live in was originally the site of a Shell gas station. And I thought that memory of the Shell gas station should be somehow represented. And I spoke to Ede, Marcos Ramirez, and said, do you know anybody in your artistic circles who could make something like a 7-foot diameter shell that could be backlit and mounted on the wall? And he got back to me and said, Belis, who is an artist who was originally born and educated, trained in Turkey, is married to one of the De La Torre brothers, Jamex, and she agreed to do this for us. She is primarily a ceramic artist, as you would know from the piece in the auction, and she made a 7-foot clay 3-dimensional representation of this shell, and then covered it with resin and cast it. And all the clay was hundreds of pounds of clay. And then she donated the clay when she no longer needed it to make the cast to school programs and orphanages in Tijuana and the Guadalupe Valley. And then she came and mounted it, and we were so excited. And when it lights up at night, it shows right down Prospect Street, that we hosted a party, which you were kind enough to come to. And a number of other sort of artists and people involved in museums and galleries all came together for a summer party, and we had the lighting of the shell. And again, the through line here, you can see Tiger, our poodle, at the door, and then to the left of Tiger, who's tan colored, you can see a black and white poodle, Belle. So it's kind of like a family portrait as well as a depiction of a commission.
It's nice that they had a chance to make their appearance.
Yes.
We're getting close to time, so I wanted
Yep.
to end with 2 questions. One is, Hugh, will you share a shameless personal plug?
This is really quite funny. My father was a professor of religion at Princeton University for 35, 40 years. And in retirement, he used to paint on holidays, on vacations. But in retirement, he really took up painting seriously. And this is one of my favorite ones that I'm the proud owner of. And the mascot of Princeton is the tiger. So he loved to paint tigers. And here, this is a tiger in the tiger lilies, if you see it above. But very quickly, he and I wrote a book together called Sacred Art in a Secular Century, which has been read by my mother, his wife, and maybe one other person. But anyway, after we did that book, he suggested that he did a lot of paintings of churches and sort of religious scenes. He suggested that I should invite him to have an exhibition at the museum of his religious paintings, and we would give a lecture and sign our book. And I said to him, you know, surely you understand what nepotism is, and I cannot invite my father to have an exhibition at the museum. So he was a little bit miffed. And then 2 years later, he had a show in Princeton, I think at the YMCA or the library, and it was written up and published in the New Jersey edition of the New York Times. So he sent that to me and said, well, maybe I'm not good enough for your museum, but apparently I'm good enough for the New York Times.
Touche.
Touche, exactly.
And then in terms of your collecting, do you have a personal collecting highlight that you would share with the audience?
Yes, this is a portrait that Michael Sitaris, an artist who lives in Carlsbad, made of me. He invited me to pose for him, and I'd never had my portrait painted, and it was an incredible series of sessions where I would sit in his garage while he worked on the portrait, and we would have terrific discussions because Michael was a child prodigy and won a full scholarship at Syracuse University in the art program. He then studied for a year at St. Martin's in London and worked as an artist in New York, supporting himself by building works for other artists like Dennis Oppenheim and Michael Heiser. And we have many mutual friends in common and New York experiences in common. So it was a great session for me, but in his working life, Michael is an ordained Greek Orthodox minister, and he's the minister of the Greek Orthodox Church, I think it's St. Helens, on Manchester Road, off the 5. So to have these sessions with him, it was like sitting with a psychiatrist or a confessor who was also a very good friend, and we would listen to the music we grew up with. So we'd be listening to the Rolling Stones, or he'd introduce me to new music like War on Drugs that his wonderful children were listening to. And many of you will recognize his work from being included in the Oceanside Museum of Art's biennial. He did a wonderful portrait of his family. So he painted this, and then he said, you know, I want to give it to you. And I said, you can't give it to me. I need to pay you, which I did. I finally persuaded him to let me pay him. Then he said, well, then I want to paint a picture of Faye and of your poodles. So then he made this, just very recently, he completed this wonderful portrait of Faye sitting in one of our chairs with the 2 dogs next to her. And it's an incredibly complex painting in terms of space. It's very cubistic in that you have multiple views and multiple reflections on the glass and the windows of the house. And this, on the left, there is, like Brancusi's column, the base of a table, and he's replicated that in a second table in the lower right. So he's an incredibly inventive painter. He paints both abstractly and representationally, but I think his figurative portraits are just extraordinary. And I'm so excited to know this artist and have a relationship with him right here in our community. I mean, I don't say these things lightly, but I compare his work very favorably to Lucian Freud. I think he's got the same sort of insight and the same technical facility. Just a brilliant artist who's working quietly in our community. So if anybody needs a portrait, they should certainly consider commissioning Michael Sitaris. He recently made a double self-portrait, which is extraordinary. Again, if we didn't already own 2 of his pieces, and it would be slightly greedy to acquire his self-portrait, but I think it's just a masterpiece. So that's my shameless plug for Michael Sitaris.
That's terrific. Yeah, Michael had 2 paintings in the Artists Alliance Biennial that you mentioned, and he was our top awardee. He, won our first place prize, and Michael and I shared history too. We both lived in the Lower East Side at the same time in the mid-'80s, so we were talking about a lot of shared experiences, and it's likely that we were at openings in the Lower East Side, probably shoulder to shoulder at some point. So,
he also, one of his churches was in Long Meadow, Massachusetts.
There you go, that Western Mass connection too. Can't get away from it.
We all have.
Fantastic. So we want to do a couple, just ask a few questions. We have about 10 more minutes, and I'm going to check and see what questions might have come in. Our anonymous is asking Hugh, who are the preeminent artists that came from UCSD? I know you mentioned Manny Farber. Are there others that you might bring up?
Well, Corey May Weems. Pardon? Carrie May Weems, I'm sorry. And, oh God, I'm so bad with names. Who did the photographer, African-American photographer?
That's Carrie May.
No, that's another one too. Lorna Simpson, another great graduate.
Simpson. That's right, yep.
Yeah. Kim McConnell, a graduate of that program. Gosh, I'm just drawing a blank on a Sunday morning, I apologize, but probably the 2 best known at the moment are Carrie May Weems and, well, somebody said Faith Ringgold. Faith Ringgold taught at UCSD and taught those 2 great African-American women artists, Lorna Simpson and Carrie May Weems. And Faith Ringgold, who, and all the time she taught at the university, she was very much an artist, and now she's having enormous recognition.
That's right, yes.
Liz Reagan is mentioning Patricia Patterson, who was not a student there, but she taught there. There were great teachers. Alan Caprow was on the faculty there, David Anchen, Eleanor Anchen, the Harrisons, great faculty members. And they have a terrific legacy of artists who came through there over the years.
Thank you for that. Yes. And then another question is, as a collector and someone who has accumulated tremendous knowledge, does Mr. Davies, Dr. Davies, find himself continuing in the scholarly review of works for authentication?
Yes, I continue to serve on the Francis Bacon Authentication Committee, and I've spent the last year, 1972-73, I went to England and was an external student at the Courtauld Art Institute, and I, during the course of that year, got to meet and interview Bacon, which was a precondition for being able to do a dissertation on his work, because there's so little published on his work, surprisingly, at that early time. And during that year, I kept a diary of all the people he introduced me to, including Lucian Freud and William Burroughs and George Orwell's widow, Sonia Orwell, and other sort of literary and artistic figures. And I kept this kind of diary. I was age 25 at the time, and I've now, at the behest of the Bacon Foundation, have cleaned it up and typed it up, and they're going to publish that next year. So that sort of keeps my scholarly hand in play. But my real art passion at the moment is going to galleries and studios with the passion of adding to our collection.
Terrific. Thanks for sharing that. I think I heard you did a lecture at the Athenaeum on Francis Bacon, right?
That's right.
Yeah, that was really informative, and I enjoyed that.
Oh,
and then there is a question that really isn't a question, but I'm going to share it with you. How and where do you guys find a fabulous, handsome, top art expert like Hugh Davies? Question.
Well, you know, I need to mention Roman Salvo, another great artist who came through UCSD's program. A good friend reminded me of this. I'm sorry, I've forgotten the question again.
It wasn't a question. There was just
an art
a plug about how handsome and what an expert you are. So bask in that.
Clearly, that person doesn't have a very good eye if they think I'm a reliable source. But there are terrific curators in all the museums in San Diego, and they are always available to advise people on collecting. And something that I encourage collectors to do is to collect from the auctions that your museum currently has, the auctions that MCA has. Again, wonderful bargains. All these pieces are pre-curated. You wouldn't accept a work for an auction if you didn't think it was a first-rate piece by that artist. So all these curators are available to have discussions. They're all doing studio visits for a living and putting together exhibitions, so that your biennial, for instance, is a wonderful opportunity to learn about artists. And I would encourage people to do the same at the San Diego Museum, Museum of Photographic Arts. Many of the artists that are shown, or almost all of them, work is available to be purchased. And the museum can put you in touch with the artist or put you in touch with the artist gallery or representative. And rather than have an art expert kind of tell you what to buy, it's really better to develop your own taste by spending time looking at art. And don't buy art as an investment, because inevitably it goes flat. Buy it because you have a passion to live with it, and it's something that will give back to you every day. We have artworks in the house that we look at every day, and it just becomes this very reassuring ambience that we live in of artworks that we love, and it reminds us of the people who made them, and some of the messages like Alison Saar that we need to be reminded of constantly.
Right. Well, that was a beautiful recommendation for budding collectors and even for experienced collectors, as a reminder, the value of living with real art in your home and appreciating it. And I think we'll end with that, unless there's anything else you both like to share. But I would like to thank you so much for joining us and taking time out of your day to be with us and share.